the summer of 1944, America was fighting a world war in the name of freedom. But at a naval ammunition depot on the California coast, some of the men fighting that war were denied the very freedom their country claimed to defend. On the night of July 17th, 1944, Port Chicago Naval Magazine became the scene of one of the deadliest disasters on the American home front. A tremendous explosion tore through the waterfront, killing 320 people and injuring hundreds more. Most of the Navy personnel killed were African American sailors assigned to the dangerous work of loading ammunition. Naval History and Heritage Command +1. Then came the order that would change everything. The surviving sailors were sent back to ammunition loading duty. The danger had not disappeared. The cause of the explosion was still unknown, and the men believed they had not been properly trained for the work. Hundreds refused. The Navy called it mutiny. 50 men would eventually stand trial. Their sentences were severe. Their convictions followed them for decades, and for 80 years the question remained: were these men mutineers who endangered military discipline, or sailors who refused to accept conditions they believed could get them killed? In 2024, the United States Navy took a historic step and exonerated the sailors connected to the Port Chicago prosecutions, acknowledging legal errors in the proceedings. National Park Service. This is the story of what happened before the explosion, what happened after it, and why the legacy of 50 black sailors still matters to the American story. If you value carefully researched history and stories that deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the most important chapters of American history are the ones that took decades to tell. In the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific was being fought thousands of miles away, but its machinery passed through a quiet stretch of California shoreline where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers met Suisun Bay. There, near the small town of Port Chicago, the United States Navy had built a facility whose importance was almost impossible to see from the outside. Behind its fences and along its waterfront, ammunition was being moved toward ships bound for American forces fighting across the Pacific. Bombs, shells, depth charges, and other munitions arrived by rail, were transferred through the naval magazine and loaded onto cargo vessels. The work was repetitive, physically exhausting, and extraordinarily dangerous. Yet in 1944, danger had become part of the routine. Port Chicago had been created because America's entry into World War II had transformed the nation's demand for military supplies. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Navy recognized that its existing ammunition facilities could not handle the enormous volume required for a global war. Construction of the Port Chicago Naval Magazine began in 1942, and by December of that year, the first ship was being loaded. Its location was strategically useful. Deep water provided access for ships, while the relative isolation of the site reduced the danger to larger population centers. Within a short time, Port Chicago became the Navy's largest ammunition shipment facility on the West Coast, but the physical location was only one part of the story. The people assigned to make this system work were shaped by another force that was deeply embedded in American military life: racial segregation. The United States was fighting a war against fascism, while its own armed forces remained segregated. African American sailors could serve, but opportunities were sharply restricted. At Port Chicago, the enlisted men who performed the ammunition loading work were overwhelmingly black, while the officers directing them were white. The arrangement reflected Navy policies that limited African American sailors largely to service, labor, and other restricted assignments. The men had entered the Navy to serve their country, but the military had not given them equal opportunities within that service. The contradiction was difficult to miss. These sailors were trusted with some of the most consequential material in the American war effort. Yet the institution entrusted with that material did not give them equal authority or equal opportunity. African American petty officers and chiefs had limited control over the work, while many of the white officers supervising the operations had little experience handling ammunition themselves. The Navy's own historical account notes that inadequate training and inexperienced leadership compounded the difficulties of the segregated system, and the work itself demanded precision. Ammunition arrived at the facility by rail. Men moved the material from boxcars toward the pier, where it was transferred aboard waiting ships. The operation could continue around the clock. As the Pacific War intensified, the pressure to move greater quantities of ammunition increased with it. In May 1944, the loading platform was widened so that 2 ships could be handled simultaneously, increasing the amount of men, equipment, rail cars, and explosives concentrated around the waterfront. The Navy wanted speed. The sailors understood the danger. Those 2 priorities did not always point in the same direction. Historical accounts indicate that many of the men working at Port Chicago had received cargo handling experience but had not received specialized formal training in loading munitions. The Navy later acknowledged that the facility had operated under difficult conditions, while historical investigations have documented the lack of adequate training and the pressure to maintain high loading rates. The work was not simply heavy labor. The men were handling explosives in an environment where a mistake could have catastrophic consequences. There were also concerns about safety procedures. Coast Guard personnel had provided recommendations concerning explosives handling, but Navy commanders considered some of those procedures incompatible with the speed they wanted at Port Chicago. The result was a working environment in which established precautions could come into conflict with operational demands. Historians have documented practices intended to increase the pace of loading, while accounts from the period and later investigations raised questions about the risks created by those practices. The sailors did not necessarily begin their assignments expecting disaster. They learned the work, they adapted, they watched more experienced men. They became accustomed to the sounds and movements of the pier, rail cars arriving, equipment operating, cargo being transferred, officers directing crews, and ammunition moving steadily toward ships that would carry it into the Pacific War. And that familiarity could itself become dangerous. When people repeatedly perform a hazardous task without catastrophe, fear can gradually become routine. A procedure that once seemed terrifying can begin to feel ordinary. At Port Chicago, the urgency of war encouraged that normalization. The Navy needed ammunition moved, ships needed to depart, and every hour mattered. The pressure became particularly visible in the competition between loading crews. Historical accounts describe officers encouraging crews to increase their output, with loading rates compared between divisions. Some accounts also describe incentives and competition designed to make the men work faster. The objective was understandable in wartime terms. More ammunition reaching the Pacific meant more supplies for American forces. But the human cost of pursuing speed around explosives was a risk that would soon become impossible to ignore. By July 1944, Port Chicago had become a crucial link in America's Pacific supply chain. The ships came and went. The rail cars continued arriving. The ammunition kept moving, and the young sailors kept doing the work. They could not have known that the ordinary rhythm of that waterfront was approaching a moment that would change the Navy, expose the contradictions of wartime segregation, and transform their own lives forever. On the evening of July 17th, two ships were positioned at the loading pier, the Liberty ship SSEA Bryan and the Victory ship SS Quinault Victory. Around them were rail cars, equipment, ammunition, and men carrying out the same dangerous task they had performed countless times before. Then, at approximately 10:19 that night, something went catastrophically wrong. The first explosion tore through the waterfront. Seconds later, a second and vastly more powerful blast followed. The night sky over Suisun Bay erupted into fire. 320 people would die, and for the sailors who survived, the question would no longer be whether the work was dangerous. They had seen the answer. Now, they would have to decide what they were willing to risk when the Navy ordered them to do it again. The explosion that came next would become one of the deadliest disasters on the American home front during the Second World War. At approximately 10:18 p.m. on July 17, 1944, the SSEA Bryan was being loaded with ammunition at Port Chicago. Nearby were rail cars containing additional explosives waiting to be transferred. The work had continued late into the evening, as it often did. There was no battlefield around them, no enemy aircraft overhead, and no warning that the waterfront was about to become a killing ground. Then the first blast came. Witnesses described a tremendous flash followed by a violent explosion. Almost immediately, a second explosion erupted with vastly greater force. The ammunition aboard the EA Bryan detonated, followed by explosives nearby. The blast ripped apart the waterfront and sent fragments of metal and burning debris across the surrounding area. The shockwave traveled far beyond the loading pier, damaging buildings and scattering wreckage across the landscape. The SSEA Bryan was destroyed. So was the SS Quinault Victory, which was positioned nearby. The loading pier was obliterated, and hundreds of men who had been working only moments earlier were gone. The final death toll was 320 people. Among them were 202 African-American enlisted sailors assigned to ammunition loading at Port Chicago. Other victims included white officers and enlisted personnel, Coast Guardsmen, a Marine, and civilians working or living in the surrounding area. More than 390 others were injured. The scale of destruction was difficult to comprehend. The waterfront that had been filled with ships, rail cars, equipment, and men was transformed almost instantly into wreckage. Pieces of the destroyed ships were thrown through the air. Ammunition and fragments traveled hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of feet. The blast damaged buildings in the nearby town of Port Chicago and was felt many miles away. For the men who survived, there was no time to understand what had happened. They had to find the wounded, they had to search for the missing, and they had to confront the terrible reality that many of the men they had worked beside only hours earlier would never return. Among those killed were sailors, whose names would later become central to the story of Port Chicago. But in the immediate aftermath, they were not symbols of racial injustice or subjects of historical debate. They were sons, brothers, husbands, friends, and shipmates who had been doing their jobs. The disaster also created an enormous investigative problem. What had caused the explosions? The Navy investigated the catastrophe, but the precise initiating cause was never conclusively established.
The available evidence could establish what had exploded and the enormous quantity of explosives involved, but it could not provide historians with a definitive explanation for exactly what triggered the initial blast. Later speculation would consider possibilities ranging from an accident during ammunition handling to other theories, but the historical record does not establish a single proven cause. That uncertainty mattered. If the explosion had resulted from careless handling, inadequate procedures, equipment failure, or some other factor, the sailors who returned to ammunition work needed to know that the danger had been addressed. But the Navy still had a war to fight. The Pacific Campaign was consuming vast quantities of ammunition. American forces were advancing across islands and preparing for increasingly demanding operations. Supply facilities like Port Chicago were not peripheral to the war. They were part of the system that kept American combat forces armed. The Navy therefore faced a difficult question. How could it resume ammunition loading while the cause of the disaster remained uncertain? The answer came quickly. The surviving sailors were transferred to other facilities, including Mare Island Naval Ammunition Depot near Vallejo, California. There, they were expected to continue performing ammunition loading work. For the sailors, the experience at Port Chicago had changed the meaning of the job. Before July 17th, loading ammunition could be understood as dangerous work. After July 17th, they had witnessed what that danger could actually do. They had watched an entire waterfront disappear in seconds. They had seen their friends killed. They had survived an explosion powerful enough to destroy ships and buildings. And now, they were being told to return to the same kind of work. The Navy's position was rooted in military necessity. Ammunition had to be loaded, and sailors were expected to obey lawful orders. But the men who had survived Port Chicago did not all view the situation in the same way. Some returned to duty. Others remained deeply concerned about the safety of the work and the training they had received. The racial dimension of the crisis could not be separated from these concerns. The men handling the ammunition were black sailors serving in a segregated navy. Many believed that they had received inadequate preparation for the work and that their white officers had not demonstrated the same familiarity with ammunition handling that they expected from those responsible for supervising them. The explosion had therefore done more than destroy a naval facility. It had exposed the fragility of a system already under pressure. And the men who had survived were about to face a choice that would place them directly against the institution they had sworn to serve. For several weeks, the Navy continued trying to restore normal operations. But normal was no longer possible. The sailors had seen too much. On August 9th, at Mare Island, hundreds of men were ordered to resume ammunition loading. Many refused. At first, the number was enormous. The Navy would later treat the refusal not as a workplace dispute, but as an act of military disobedience. The word that would define the sailors' lives was about to enter the story: mutiny. And once that word was attached to them, the question would no longer be simply whether Port Chicago had been safe. It would become a question of loyalty, obedience, race, and justice. The explosion killed 320 people in a matter of seconds. The confrontation that followed would last for decades, and the first battle would take place not on the Pacific front, but inside.
By the evening of July 17, 1944, Port Chicago had settled into the rhythm that had become normal during the war. The naval magazine operated around the clock, moving ammunition toward ships destined for American forces fighting across the Pacific. Along the waterfront stood two merchant vessels, the SSEA O'Brien, which was already being loaded, and the SS Quinault Victory, positioned nearby and also involved in the operation. Together with ammunition on railcars at the pier, more than 5,000 tons of munitions were concentrated in the area. There was nothing about the scene that suggested that history was about to change. Men were working around explosives as they had done before. Railcars stood alongside the pier. Cargo was being transferred. Officers supervised the operation. The ships waited to carry their deadly cargo toward the Pacific. Then, at approximately 10:18 that night, something happened on the pier. According to the Navy's historical record, witnesses first heard a hollow ring and the sound of splintering wood. Then came an explosion. A brilliant flash erupted into the darkness, followed by fire and smoke rising above the waterfront. Smaller explosions began occurring within the growing cloud of debris. And then, roughly 6 seconds later, the night became something almost impossible to describe. The ammunition aboard the E.A. Bryan detonated in one enormous blast. The explosion tore the ship apart. The pier disappeared. Structures around it were obliterated. The nearby Quinault Victory was violently thrown upward and shattered. Burning fragments and unexploded ammunition were hurled across the surrounding area. A column of fire and smoke rose more than 2 miles into the sky. The force traveled far beyond Port Chicago. Buildings were damaged across the naval installation. Windows shattered in nearby communities. The blast was felt across the San Francisco Bay Area, and the seismic shock was detected at great distances. The waterfront, only moments earlier a functioning center of wartime activity, had become a field of wreckage. Every one of the 320 men working on duty that night was killed instantly. Among the dead were 202 African American enlisted sailors assigned to the ammunition loading units. The remaining victims included other Navy personnel, Coast Guardsmen, a Marine, and civilians. Nearly 400 people were injured. For those outside the immediate blast zone, the first moments were filled with confusion. Some people initially feared an enemy attack. Others thought there had been an earthquake. But there was no enemy fleet approaching the California coast. The destruction had come from the ammunition facility itself. The disaster presented rescuers with a terrible problem. Fires continued to burn. Unexploded ordnance remained scattered throughout the area. Debris covered the ground. Men who had survived the initial blast had to move through an environment where another explosion could occur at moment. Emergency crews and Navy personnel began responding almost immediately. Some men risked their lives to prevent fires from reaching additional ammunition. The rescue effort continued amid wreckage and unexploded shells. The distinction between rescue work and further danger had almost disappeared. The human cost was overwhelming. For the sailors who had worked alongside the dead, the numbers could not capture what had happened. Men who had shared meals, barracks, duties, jokes, arguments, and long hours on the waterfront were suddenly missing. In many cases, the violence of the explosion made individual identification extraordinarily difficult. The Navy faced the enormous task of recovering bodies and identifying the dead while simultaneously securing the ammunition that remained. And beneath all of it was one question. What had caused the explosion? The answer would prove elusive. A Navy court of inquiry convened on July 21st, only 4 days after the disaster. Investigators interviewed witnesses and examined the wreckage, attempting to reconstruct what had happened during the final moments before the first blast. The investigation continued for 39 days. But the destruction had erased much of the physical evidence that might have revealed the precise initiating event. The court ultimately could not determine with certainty what caused the initial explosion. That distinction is important. Historians can establish the enormous quantity of explosives present and can reconstruct the sequence of destruction with considerable confidence. But the exact event that triggered the first detonation remains unresolved. The Navy's own historical record acknowledges that the cause could not be identified because of the lack of immediate eyewitness evidence and the extensive destruction of the pier. What investigators did examine, however, was the way ammunition had been handled before the explosion. That investigation would become controversial. The court identified operational shortcomings, including problems involving training and ammunition handling practices. Yet it did not find the white officers in command responsible for negligence. Later Navy historians have acknowledged that the segregated structure of the facility and the treatment of the African American enlisted workforce became central to understanding the tragedy's aftermath. For the moment, however, the survivors had little time to debate the investigation. They were grieving. They were injured. And many were traumatized by what they had witnessed. Yet the war had not stopped. American forces still needed ammunition. Ships still had to be loaded. And the Navy still needed men to perform the work. Within weeks, the waterfront operation would begin moving again. The survivors would be transferred away from Port Chicago, and the Navy would eventually order them to resume ammunition handling elsewhere. This was where the disaster took an unexpected turn. The explosion had destroyed the physical evidence of what happened on July 17th. But it had not destroyed the memory of the men who survived. Those sailors now knew exactly what ammunition could do when something went wrong. They had seen the consequences with their own eyes. And when the Navy ordered them back to the same dangerous work, the question would no longer be theoretical. It would be personal. The men who had survived Port Chicago were about to confront the Navy over an order they believed could put their lives in danger again. Within weeks, that confrontation would produce one of the most consequential military justice cases in American history. The explosion had taken 320 lives in seconds. What happened afterward would test the meaning of obedience itself.